Hello, everyone. This is Claire Wu with BERYL Consulting Group, your host today. Has been in the trench of AI applications in market research for nearly a decade, not just studying the space, but also actively building tools and systems that automate and scale research itself. He's been working at the intersection of AI, market research, and software development for over 8 years, and has had a front row seat to how this field has evolved. Robert, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks for the invitation.
So to start us off, can you please tell us a little bit about robotic online intelligence and your work in this space? How would you describe where we actually are today with AI and the large language models in market research?
Yeah, so with robotic online intelligence, or ROI, we specialize in bespoke automation of market research. And we have an enterprise SaaS platform that cuts across that workflow, right? So it's from the data collection to all kinds of AI enhancements in classification, summarization, data extraction, translation, all the way through to publication. And we primarily work with data companies, investment and research firms. But like you mentioned, our more unique or unusual vantage point is really because at the same time, I've been running an independent research firm focused on China housing markets. And that's for the last 14 years. So we've not just been building tools, we've been using them every day. And that internal development origin, I think, kind of keeps us honest about what works and what doesn't. Everybody is experimenting. We are zooming in on the domain of investment management, investment research, right? Within that category. I would probably group the major use cases and what people do in a few categories. One would be when you have a large volume of SEC filings or internal proprietary deal documents or investment reports or some stack of compliance documents. And the purpose in that use case is to have a natural language interrogation of those documents, either internally or for clients. So that means deployment of RAG or retrieval augmented generation as a method. The second bucket is, you could call it sort of detection of signals and anomalies. And I think that's where a lot of hedge funds are focused on, largely to sniff through large volumes of information to find some unique signal or pattern. And in most cases, to actually flag it to a human analyst, a human investigator. So that's the second category. Then you have the latest sort of agentic workflows, where ultimately it's about creation of that equivalent of a human analyst in a digital form. That in practice means deconstructing this notion of deep research and workflow, what the analyst or human analyst would actually do. And there's a lot happening in that space, many publicized cases. We are also quite active in that area. And then you have sort of the lighter touch. What almost everybody does is more individual productivity. So people have ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, Copilot, at the front end. I think these are the main buckets that we see today. A lot of experimentation.
From your experience, what do you think is actually working today, and where have you seen the large language models deliver real and repeatable value in market research?
I think that relates to what LLMs or large language models are really good at. And if you really think about this, it's about processing unstructured text. So that implies that when it comes to summarization, data extraction, classification, translation, and those kind of components, you can have very good proven use cases. And what we've seen is that the deployments that seem to work quite well tend to treat LLMs as components of the bigger solution, with a lot of orchestration, a lot of deterministic rules to supervise these components, and of course, a human in the loop, especially with all the security and accuracy requirements in the world of finance or investment. A couple of examples using public information to build proprietary databases, right, as a use case, and often what our clients do. That's where LLMs can make it much more efficient and automated in terms of that classification, data extraction, handling the whole process. For China property, one of the things that works for us is monitoring thousands of public online sources to detect those weaker signals from local information. It's the things that you may not find typically on the Reuters or Bloomberg. I think in the agentic workflow, I would say in investment sort of research case, it's still about the control over the process. In our approach, for instance, we kind of decompose it into 50 parameters. Depending on the type of questions you have, control over many, many parameters, how you want the workflow to behave.
And now that AI tools are becoming, as we discussed, widely accessible, and seems like everyone had the access to similar models, where do you think the real...
I like to think about it as sort of in a simple framework of maybe 3 layers, where first you have the new table stakes. So if you're not automating certain things, enabling your team to be more productive with all those tools, then you may be lagging behind. But that's not really a real long-term advantage, because everybody will do the same thing, and it's cheap to do. And then you have the second layer where you can have an edge because you figure out how to better interrogate earnings transcripts or some groups of filings on business development companies or some other sort of short-term insight. But if it's not truly proprietary, other people will do the same thing, right? So it gives you an advantage that you can constantly chase a new one. That's level 2. And ultimately, for the third part, the more sustainable edge, that needs to be either around proprietary data or like truly proprietary data, or some sort of like real embedded proprietary mechanism or system or metadata or data governance around ontology, the orchestration of how all this process is done, or it goes back to people. So ultimately, it would be the people that would engineer that system. And interestingly, we talking about BERYL ELITES at the last conference in New York in November. I think that was one of the themes, right? Where is that moat? Besides the data, it goes back to the talent, the skill set that would engineer all of it. That's a great irony of AI and LLMs, that the big edge comes from the human talent. So having said that, we also see a number of people would pursue the sort of the second mover advantage in this space. Other people explore and try and fail, and you learn from what others tried and come in prepared with when things are more proven.
We talk about a lot of advantage that AI and LLM brings today. And on the flip side, we're just so curious to know, where do things break down from your perspective? Where do you see the firms get into trouble when applying AI to research or even investment decision making?
So that goes, I think, back to the earlier discussion on what works, and as like a flip side. Like if you really look at under the hood what LLMs are, you could oversimplify that this is just statistical associations of keywords. And that comes with a big challenge on accuracy, right? And all the hallucinations and risks around it. So if the particular use case involves the need for high accuracy, which is not always the case, right? The discovery, exploration, some potential signals do not need that. But in many cases, when 90% is not good enough, then you have a challenge. That's kind of one. Second, somewhat related to it is the evaluation, which I don't think it's often talked about in all the demos, because it's great that we can synthesize large volume of filings and last 7 days of reports around the US REIT market. If it's about specific data points, it's easier to evaluate, right? But if it's about the insight, how do you evaluate the quality of that? So then if you use another LLM to evaluate that, well, who evaluates the evaluator? Not dissimilar to what we have with humans, but that remains a challenge because it can be very expensive to evaluate. We had our own use case in this, which on the challenging side. So an interesting illustration where on the US REITs market, where even in the small universe of those few hundred firms, if you try to synthesize large volume of information, actually challenging to do with LLMs properly. Because 95% right, but there'll always be that sort of funny one. But then if you take a bit less ambitious approach and focus only on those components, back what we were saying earlier, then it works, right? It's controllable. So I think that's one issue. And then you have the the third point in terms of the demo and production, right? So the big difference we all always see. I have here on my desk my Raspberry Pi that runs OpenClaw, secure sandbox, not connected to anything else. And I talk to it through Telegram, and it's fun. It's fantastic, right? It's a great experimentation. It actually works. But that's not going to be in any way related to what you would actually deploy in any serious enterprise deployment today. So I think it goes back to the, curbing enthusiasm a little bit and checking for or recognizing the LLMs for what they are.
And not only there's a challenge happening here in the AI space, but also the space of change is really incredible. We have the new models happening. We have the new capabilities almost every week. So in terms of that, how do you build on a layer that keeps shifting? What do you think the firms should be doing today to actually position themselves well for what's coming in the future?
How do you tweak, right? So how do you keep up? So when there's so much change, perhaps the best strategy is to focus on what does not change. I think this means that one needs to be model agnostic and focus much more on that orchestration layer. So figuring out the whole workflow and organizational alignment, knowing that technically what works today may be very different sort of a few weeks later. Especially for larger organizations, that's more challenging because the deployment takes time. Smaller organizations have less resources, but can be more nimble. So orchestration, focus on the workflow. And of course, to the earlier point on that competitive edge, looking for or building proprietary data of some sort. That can be the moat. It doesn't necessarily need to be the new database. It could be the data governance layer. It could be the ontology specific to a particular use case tied to internal data. We focus on the bespoke aspect because that's where you think you can connect to that source of true advantage with internal systems. But I think it's model-wise and LLM-wise, it's staying neutral to whatever is best at the time and how to make it easy to plug and play the latest and best.
So to wrap up our today discussion, I think a few things really stand out from this conversation. One is that, as you mentioned and we talked about, AI and large language models are evolving rapidly, and the real value already comes from very specific and repeatable use cases. At the same time, many of the risk seems to come from over-reliance on technology. The pace is quick, but we have to check with the quality. Without strong framework and domain judgment behind it, we cannot do it. And ultimately, even in a world where models are widely accessible, the real edge, as you mentioned, comes from how firms structure their data, workflows, and decision-making process around them. So this really helped move the conversation beyond the hype and into what actually drives the advantage today. So thank you so much, Robert, for your time. This was a great conversation. I'm your host, Claire Wu, and see you next time in BERYL ELITES.